Imagine for a second a world completely on the brink of absolute transformation, a massive interconnected geography that is about to be completely rewired by the sheer willpower and the insane velocity of a single human mind. Back in the 4th century BCE, the known world was essentially split in two. Over in the west, you had these fractured, fiercely independent city-states, and stretching across the east, a colossal ancient superpower. It was, quite literally, a world waiting for a spark. What we're doing here is decoding a historical shockwave. We're going to look at how a perfectly primed system, driven by an unstoppable force, can permanently alter the very fabric of human history.
And that spark, of course, was Alexander. His story is the exact point where immense personal ambition meets massive historical consequence. This isn't merely a timeline of some ancient king conquering territory. Not at all. It's actually a profound case study of what happens when extraordinary, borderline obsessive personal drive perfectly aligns with the exact right historical moment. The world at that time was an absolute powder keg. The ancient Greek states had finally been unified under Macedonian control, which created this highly concentrated military powerhouse. Meanwhile, right across the Aegean Sea, the mighty Persian Empire had grown a bit complacent. Its vast administrative networks were starting to fray at the edges. So when Alexander steps onto the stage, he is the match hitting that powder keg.
Now, to really wrap our heads around how he pulled this off, we kind of have to redefine what conquest actually means. It's so much more than just a chain of battles where one army beats another. Instead, I want you to think of it as a living, breathing system of power, a system that actively reshapes geography, rewrites culture, and completely changes political habits. True conquest is what happens when power moves much, much faster than existing institutions can absorb it. It's a violent, structural disruption that overwrites the very DNA of a civilization. Picture two completely different, massive forces crashing into each other. On one side, you have Macedonia. Think of it as a highly tuned, extremely lethal hunting rifle. Alexander actually inherited this weapon from his father, King Philip II, who completely revolutionized ancient warfare. Philip invented the sarissa, this crazy 18-foot-long pike that essentially turned the Macedonian phalanx into an impenetrable, moving wall of spikes. It was a fast, intensely disciplined war machine built specifically for outward projection. And on the other side, you have Persia. Vast, incredibly resource-rich, but functioning a lot more like a giant sprawling marketplace. It had immense size and wealth for sure, but it struggled terribly with slow internal coordination, relying on these distant local governors who took absolutely forever to mobilize. But, even the sharpest hunting rifle needs someone to pull the trigger. And that brings us to the mind of the conqueror himself. Alexander was psychologically groomed for absolute greatness from the day he was born. He was tutored by Aristotle. He was raised inside this sweeping, epic narrative about power and destiny. He genuinely believed he was directly descended from Achilles, the legendary hero of Troy. He was constantly surrounded by reminders that he was expected to completely surpass ordinary rulers. Because of this deeply ingrained mythology, his enormous ambition demanded aggressive, incredibly high-stakes action rather than cautious day-to-day rule. For Alexander, his very identity became his strategy. Hesitation wasn't just a bad tactical move, it was a deep, personal failure. So all these distinct elements combined to create a true perfect storm. The mechanics of his incredibly rapid rise basically boil down to 4 distinct interacting pressures. First up, that highly trained Macedonian military gave him the physical tools to act. Second, his intensely ingrained identity gave him the unstoppable will to act. Third, the Persian Empire's internal weakness and sluggish communication gave him the perfect target to exploit. And finally, sheer speed and relentless momentum prevented the enemy from ever catching their breath once the campaign actually began. It's the continuous rapid-fire interaction of these 4 forces that created a system that was historically impossible to stop. But to actually execute this massive campaign, he first had to establish his absolute authority. He didn't just blindly charge east right out of the gate. Actually, scratch that. He did charge, but he charged locally first. He ruthlessly locked down Greece. When the city of Thebes rebelled shortly after he took the throne, Alexander didn't negotiate. There was no treaty. He completely leveled the city. He spared only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar and literally sold the survivors into slavery. It was a brutal, incredibly calculated psychological message to the rest of the world. By securing his base so decisively, he made his home territory safe enough to gamble on an unprecedented outward expansion without constantly having to look over his shoulder. With his home turf locked down, he finally crosses the Hellespont into Asia. But he doesn't try to defeat the massive Persian Empire in one giant cinematic showdown. That would be impossible. Instead, he systematically attacks it piece by piece.
Think of the Persian Empire like a massive, towering dam, and Alexander is just creating tiny, high-pressure cracks. Take the Battle of the Granicus, his very first major engagement in Asia. He directly charged and defeated the local Persian governors. He used this early, highly targeted victory to crack the entire system's confidence. These early wins didn't just take enemy soldiers off the board, they fundamentally changed the psychology of everyone watching. Once local leaders started believing that this giant Persian dam might actually fail, their loyalty to the empire became incredibly fragile.
Beating an army in an open field, however, is one thing. Fortified cities? That's an entirely different ballgame. Unlike an open plain where you can just march a phalanx forward, a walled city poses what we call a locked room problem. Brute military force alone just isn't going to cut it when you're staring up at massive 50-foot stone walls and thousands of heavily entrenched defenders. It requires a completely different tactical approach. We're talking intense physical engineering and absolutely unrelenting psychological pressure to metaphorically and literally break the door down.
These sieges were just gruesome, grueling realities. The whole objective shifted from quick tactical dominance to a brutal war of sheer endurance. The Siege of Tyre stands out as the ultimate example of this ruthless determination. Tyre was the supposedly impregnable island fortress. People thought it was completely unconquerable. No way anyone was getting in. But Alexander had to force the city to realize a really hard truth, that yielding to his army and opening those gates was a vastly better option than continuing a completely hopeless defense. It was entirely about grinding them down and outlasting their will to fight, no matter how long it took.
The absolute breaking point in this phase was severing the city's lifelines. And what he did at Tyre is just mind-blowing. Since the city was half a mile offshore and he didn't initially have a supreme navy, Alexander literally ordered his men to build a massive land bridge, a causeway, right through the ocean to reach the island. Let that sink in. By physically connecting the island to the mainland, he surrounded the city and completely cut off all maritime supplies. He took the static holding of a location which normally heavily favors the defender and turned it into an inevitable crushing defeat. You simply cannot hold a wall forever if your people are starving and the ocean itself is literally being paved over by your enemy.
And the payoff for all that brutal effort, it went way beyond just seizing a strategic piece of land. It absolutely destroyed a symbol of resistance. When Tyre finally fell after 7 agonizing months, the political consequences rippled out instantly. Conquering a fiercely defended city like that converts pure military advantage into lasting psychological and political submission. It completely crushes the hope that anyone else coming behind him will be able to stop him. After seeing the absolute annihilation of Tyre, numerous other cities further down the Mediterranean coast looked at him, looked at their own walls, and simply opened their gates and surrendered without firing a single arrow.
As these victories started stacking up, the whole campaign evolved into this relentless system of movement. Every single victory fueled the next one. It provided fresh resources, extreme prestige, and unhindered access to even more territory. It created this rapidly tightening spiral of momentum. The Persian king, Darius III, was constantly forced to flee, desperately trying to regroup his massive armies at grand battles like Issus and Gaugamela. But Alexander was just moving much, much faster than the sprawling Persian administration could ever manage. He was quite literally outrunning their ability to organize a coherent defense, turning this massive, ancient empire into a rapidly collapsing house of cards.
But all of this incredibly rapid expansion brings us to a massive, unavoidable contradiction, a real paradox. How do you hold together a world that was built so quickly? Can an empire built entirely on rapid movement, violent disruption, and constant psychological dominance actually sustain itself when the movement finally has to stop?
The harsh reality is that the exact same speed that made his explosive campaign successful was also creating massive, unbearable strain. The armies were being stretched incredibly thin across vast, unfamiliar continents. Supply lines grew dangerously, impossibly long. The literal breaking point finally came when his own men mutinied at the Hyphasis River in India. They just refused to march a single step further after years of endless war. And then, on the brutal return march through the barren Gedrosian desert, thousands of his soldiers perished simply from a lack of water and basic supplies. This entire massive structure relied almost exclusively on Alexander's personal authority and physical presence. The incredible velocity that built the empire was the exact same force tearing at its seams. Which brings us to the ultimate heartbreaking irony of Alexander's entire life. When he died suddenly and unexpectedly in Babylon at the age of just 32, his unified political empire shattered almost instantly. It fractured into warring successor kingdoms, led by his own generals. The The broken empire simply couldn't survive without him sitting at the center of it. But his true legacy, it wasn't a single border drawn on a map. It was what we can call the permanent wake, the unchangeable mixing of the ancient world's cultures, languages, and ideas. He founded dozens of cities, many famously named Alexandria, embedding Greek architecture, language, and administration deep into Asia and Egypt. Hellenistic culture spread like wildfire, and entirely new trade routes connected distant regions of the globe forever.
So what is the core systemic takeaway from this monumental historical shift? It's what we can call the map of the possible. When absolutely unstoppable momentum meets a fragile, slow-moving world, the immediate political victory might fade rapidly. The borders drawn by the sword might completely vanish in a generation. But the world itself? The world is permanently, irreversibly altered. Alexander didn't just conquer territories. He fundamentally changed what humanity believed was capable of being achieved. He permanently widened the horizon of human ambition.
And that leaves us with a final, genuinely fascinating thought to ponder. If history is violently shaped when unstoppable momentum meets fragile systems, where might we see the next equivalent of this force in our modern world? Think about the insanely rapid disruptive changes we see today in sweeping technology, in global economics, or in sudden, massive social movements. Who or what is moving faster than our current institutions can possibly absorb?